power, and we end up censoring Judy Blume.
Well, John, first of all, what we're talking about here, what at least I'm trying to talk about, is not censorship, because censorship is unconstitutional. It's perfectly clear that prior restraint by government is unacceptable in this country, and that's precisely the way it should be. What we are talking about is post factum prosecution, depending upon, in greatest part, 42 states have obscenity laws. The federal jurisdiction has very strong obscenity laws. We're talking about essentially the definition of the U.S. Supreme Court in Miller versus California, 1973. Now, the Constitution has no problem with this. Please understand that. And it's very clear in the Czaplinski's case. The Czaplinski case said simply this: the rationale or the reason that obscenity has no First Amendment protection is the following. The message conveyed by obscene speech is of such slight social value that it is always outweighed by the compelling interests of society as manifested in the laws by elected representatives. Now, what did Miller say? The material must appeal to the lustful or prurient interest. It must be patently offensive, and that typically means depiction or description of excretory or sexual organs or functions. Those two are to be measured by community standards. The third is the work taken as a whole must lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. That's the so-called reasonable person. Now, that is not an easy definition to fulfill, except by material that is rather gross, and also in the hands of a skilled prosecutor, not the chap out in Cincinnati, mind. So the point being that we do have free speech in this country, but just like running a sound truck with loud music through your neighborhood at 2 a.m., that is impermissible legally. You're not allowed to libel people, despite the Sullivan decision, which weakened our libel laws. You're not allowed to falsely advertise. You're not allowed to yell, as what's his name, Holmes said, you cannot yell fire in a theater that's crowded where there is no fire. This is getting to your point about responsibilities. And some of these things are not just moral, they're legal. And that's the way this country has been. People, I admire John. We met in 1971. I've liked him ever since. The problem that he carries on his shoulders is a difficult one. He has the problem that the Constitution is not in his corner because obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. He has the problem that 42 states have these laws on their books. The federal jurisdiction goes on increasing the severity of the laws, the fact that obscenity is a predicate crime for a criminal RICO, the fact that in this Ohio case a year ago, the mere possession of child pornography is a crime now in 27 states, and that sort of thing. The court is behind that concept, the Congress is behind the concept, the Constitution is behind the concept, and John, the absolutists, are in the minority. And this is exactly what Gonzalez said in that 2-live proved case. He said this is a traditional antithesis between the forces of anything goes and enough already. And the majority is with enough already. But
you guys will get in on this. Now, you see the problem? The Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting freedom of religion. To most people, a moral issue is a religious issue. You see?
It's set up as Supreme Court.
You see the problem? Now,
For you.
no, I'm not taking any position on this, Joe. I'm saying you can see the problem here. If Congress is saying that, and yet the Constitution says that, and yet laws are made under other provisions. Now, let's take this a step further. On many campuses today, there is a movement afoot called PC, or political correctness, politically correct speech. The idea, as in the morality issue, is that it is not right to say things that may appear to be sexist or racist or whatever. And so therefore any material that would mention these is restricted from the campus, either by at Stanford University, there were in fact official regulations passed. On other campuses it's just a question of social pressure. Chuck, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that one of the problems we're going to have here is we are going to mix up two groups in our society, the private and the public, and there is a difference. Rod is right. He can say whatever he wants in his newspaper, but remember, I don't have to buy the Daily Dover Democrat. Marilyn's problem is, I do have to pay my taxes. And therefore, she tonight can do whatever she wants in her art gallery, as long as it's not a government-sanctioned art exhibit, where the taxpayers are paying. She's free to do whatever the hell she wants at the Courier. Now, here's where it gets tricky. If I work for her, and I put something up on the wall that she doesn't like, she can tell me to take it down, because she's private, I'm her employee. I can't go to John and say, she made me take down something that I felt had an important message, and I'm entitled to have it up. What are you going to tell me, John? You're going to say it's a private gallery, she can do whatever she wants. Now, the problem with the campus is the same. If you have a private campus, the president and the board of trustees, rightly or wrongly, could say that on this campus we will not allow certain epithets to be used. We will not allow our campus newspaper. That's where it gets tricky. But there are some limits that we can put. If it's the University of New Hampshire, no. Big difference between government and private. And the Bill of Rights, if we get back to first principles, says Congress shall make no law. It's been since read due to the 14th Amendment to in effect say the government will make no law. So Rod's right. He can print any damn thing he wants. He can get sued afterwards. But, you know, if it goes over a line, and he's aware of that, but the government shouldn't stop it on the front end any more than the government should say to students, you can't say certain things. On the other hand, if you're on a private campus, you're not as free as, just as I'm not as free working for you, but to me that's a fundamentally different set of principles, and I think we just need to keep that in mind, the private versus government. Because that's why the Bill of Rights gets a little confused. People say at their place of employment, don't I have a right to say whatever I want or to put whatever I want up on the wall? Well, is it a government office? Are you a government employee? Or is it a private store or business? And so that's where the Bill of Rights, and I think part of our problem is through lack of education. The public doesn't understand the Bill of Rights doesn't protect you everywhere in every setting. It only protects you vis-a-vis your government.
Which is why Henry Hyde has introduced a bill to basically put that concept into the private sector, in the private university.
Probably through public funding. In effect, you don't get federal money if...
To create statutory, to create a law which would prohibit in the private sector the prohibition of speech. And he's filed that, and the Civil Liberties Union supports it, and I think it's the first time in history that Henry Hyde, the Civil Liberties Union.
Well, let me ask, can I ask this, because this is something I'd love to see if I could bring Marilyn and Rod's points together in John's office. John, I come into you and I say, look, Marilyn and all these professionals and these well-educated pros turned my grant down. I applied for $15,000. I wanted, as John Fleck did, to put a Torah in a toilet and paint swastikas over it. And she said that that's not art, it's anti-Semitic, we're not funding it. Don't I have a constitutional right to expression on the taxpayer's dollar? And why did I get turned down, but Maplethorpe got approved?
Well,
and are you going to defend my challenge to all NEA funding? Because it is prima facie, the government blesses 1 out of every 4 grants and denies 3 out of 4.
There's a strong argument.
What would you do?
Well, there's a strong argument made that perhaps, if the arts should really be free, then there should be no public funding of the arts at all. And you can make that argument.
What do you think? In a civil
Well,
ideal
I think if the government is going to fund it, then it needs to do, in fact, what it has done. Creates a pool of money and let artists make their decisions about what it's going to do with it. Now, I don't want the government in there saying what's acceptable or not acceptable.
All right, John, let me take my example. 4 of the 5 artists on my panel were of a certain religious persuasion, and that's why I think I got turned down, says John Fleck, for this exhibit that I wanted.
Well,
now, do we have a problem?
Well, you have a very strong burden to prove that. If there's
So you're going to
discrimination.
take this case for this guy?
I got to look at the facts to see what kind of have a case of discrimination there or not. But what's happened, I think what happens with the NEA money is, when it works best, is that it creates money, and artists make the decision. The government is not in there making decisions about the
But these
content.
are government-sanctioned artists making the decision. Don't forget, I can't sign up and say, I want to be an NEA artist and approve grants. I mean, there's a process of the government blessing certain artists and saying, you've got the taxpayers' dollars, only
Well,
give
is
them
it
to
the government
these.
blessing them, or is it, or are artists, you see, I'm not so sure it's the government blessing. The government
Government money.
creates a pool of money, and then decisions are made by artists as to how that money
It's
is
the same as the
spent.
scientific community. People submit for a scientific grant, scientists evaluate it, and they decide which ones are the most worthwhile. There has to be some kind of a
But isn't there a
process.
difference between freedom of expression in the First Amendment sense, John, and scientific funding into quarks and atoms and molecules? Is there a difference? I think there is.
Well, you see, what I want to do is to keep the government out of making content-related decisions about how.
But they inherently have to. They're picking people to give out government money for government-sanctioned art.
Who's making the decisions?
The government council.
That's your answer to the problem, Chuck. As long as somebody's going to be making decisions, someone will and someone won't get it. And you won't always agree with the decision.
I know, but
So the
unlike,
option is, and you know, it's a great argument, but it's not real. Someone has to make decisions.
no,
So you're not going to agree with
but
that.
Rod, isn't there a difference between First Amendment expressive decisions, such as art or plays or something like a scientific research project at a university, which also gets government funding? In other words, are all government grants fungible, John? They're all the same, or are there some that are First Amendment sensitive and some that aren't?
Well, I still don't like the way you set this up.
Well, I
don't want to step in
I
that
did it
trap.
intentionally.
Yeah, no.
It was willful.
Yeah, but,
It was willful.
Well, I think you have to,
Is that art?
the actual process is, some
Political art?
It's political art.
some difficult things get funded and some get turned down, and the panel records everybody's comments of the panelists, and if you call up the NEA, they'll tell you what the comments were and why you were turned down.
Is-
I mean, the NIH does similar political things. I mean,
Sure.
there was a survey recently of how much research was done on women's diseases, and there's very little compared to those done on men's diseases. I mean, you can't say politics doesn't enter into this.
Wouldn't it be an interesting society if people understood science enough that they could complain about a grant? Some physicist got,
We're all art experts.
we're all learning.
if you really want to make the argument, we ought to be able to let citizens pick and choose how the government spends our money. And I've got a long list of things. And the Defense Department does it.
Let me move this to something that all of us have clearly in our minds, and that's the recent Persian Gulf War. I suppose most of you are aware that in many communities, I don't know if it was true in your community or not, that the idea, once that war got going, the idea of expressing opposition to it or to the use of war and violence as a solution to problems was such an unpopular thing that there were, in fact, some cases of physical violence, some government intervention, but only, I think, when the police really confused their role, and those were quickly done away with. Diane, how do you feel about that? Should we have a society, our sons and daughters are over there risking their lives, never mind how the decision got made, they're there, they're on the firing line. Is it okay for me back here to say, look, this is a dumb thing and I'm not in favor of that?
Of course, it's okay.
It is
It
okay.
has to be, it has to be okay. Otherwise, what are we fighting for?
That's interesting. What do you think about that, Rod? Did you cover any cases of picketers who weren't too keen
Absolutely.
about the pacifists?
It was kind of interesting having been through the military during the Vietnam era and then sort of being back in college when most of the protests were going on, to deal with this war and to have it start. And the first day that we went out and covered high school students that had a walkout school protest, to to get calls from people who I knew were my age protesting to us that we covered the demonstrations by high school students. I found myself saying, well, wait a minute, don't you remember? And they were emphatic that these kids don't know what they're talking about. So listen to this. They don't know what they're talking about. You shouldn't give them any credibility by writing about what they're doing or taking pictures of them and putting them on page one. Now, we were certainly not making a political statement, in fact. We essentially endorsed the war and the way it went. But we certainly also felt it was our job to report what was going on in our community without any tainting of political flavor. I was shocked. Another lesson. I know I'm not learning everything very fast, but it was another lesson that you have to be strong and be willing to stand up for what you do, particularly if you put it out for public review. And if anyone had tried to stop us, we probably would have just got our hackles up and kept on going. What in fact finally happened was most of the demonstrations petered out, and that was sort of the end of it. But to have it start right away, well, we haven't learned anything again.
All right, yeah, I love the talk that, we kept saying, well, we're over there fighting for our way of life. We're fighting for our values. And of course, one of the values is the right to dissent and the right to speak, and then you turn around and publish it and punish the dissenters. And you say, whoa, what are we fighting over there for? Is it for that, or is it to return the, the monarchy in Kuwait, in the name of women's rights?
Now let's just take this a step further. Okay, so all the things that have been happening have made many people in our country apparently significantly more concerned with patriotism than they were before. So someone who disagrees with that decides, well, they're going to wear or burn or somehow deface the American flag. Now, is that protected speech? Joe, I want to ask you to answer this because it's not, I don't think it's a morality issue, but I bet you've got something to say to that.
It's interesting, we started off this evening with a very literal reading of the First Amendment and the notion that even though it came chronologically subsequent to the Constitution itself, that it was the sine qua non. Without that, in other words, the back of the train was more important than the engine. And it's an interesting concept. I'm not a great admirer of Mr. Berger's